Welcome, friends, to this webinar on John Boswell and Not a Tame Lion, a dialogue with Craig Bettendorf and Ralph Hexter. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship on queer religious history. Tonight, we are pleased to present an up-close and personal look at Yale historian John Boswell, who lived from 1947 to 1994. Boswell was a world-renowned scholar of medieval history, conversant in 14 languages, ancient and modern, and was unapologetically both gay and Christian. The 2023 film documentary, Not a Tame Lion, written and directed by Craig Bettendorf, presents Boswell's closest friends, students, colleagues, and family members, recounting his life and impact, as well as a brief excerpt from one of his spellbinding lectures. The documentary focuses on the final years before his untimely death, as he feverishly worked to complete same-sex unions in medieval Europe, a book that changed the trajectory of the marriage equality debate. Tonight, you will hear filmmaker Bettendorf, along with Ralph Hexter, Boswell's close friend and academic colleague, discuss the inspiration and vision behind the film and how Boswell still illuminates and informs study and debate on religion and sexuality in our day. Craig Bettendorf is a film writer and director who spent the better part of the 1990s organizing, promoting, and finding common ground for acceptance and inclusion of members of the LGBTQ community. This work led him to be among the principal signatories of the 1996 National Freedom to Marry Resolution, denouncing the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. Bettendorf's film projects include the 2016 to 2022 series Treading Yesterday, the 2020 documentary feature Homo Say What, and 2023's Not a Tame Lion. Bettendorf's projects have benefited from his personal experience as a gay man and former community activist in juxtaposing societal intolerance of LGBTQ people in the past with present-day acceptance, while at the same time revealing the inherent challenges existing in both environments. Ralph Hexter, Ph.D., is former provost, executive vice chancellor, and interim chancellor of the University of California, Davis, where he continues as a distinguished professor of classics and comparative literature. He first got to know John Boswell when he was an undergraduate and Boswell was a graduate student at Harvard. Hexter assisted Boswell during the preparation of Boswell's groundbreaking 1980 book, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, Gay People in Western Europe from the Beginning of the Christian Era to the 14th Century, and was his colleague at Yale, first as a graduate student, and then as an assistant and associate professor from 1977 to 1991. Hexter was involved in the final preparation for publication of same-sex unions in medieval Europe and serves as Boswell's literary executive. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box of the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during a Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay after the webinar has concluded and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Asati, who is the tech manager for this program. And now, I am pleased to welcome Ralph Hexter and Craig Bettendorf to talk about John Boswell and Not a Tame Lion.
Thank you, Mark.
Good evening, Mark, and thank you, Asati.
I had not heard of St. Surgeon Bacchus before I discovered this text, and so I went and looked up Surgeon Bacchus to see who they were, thinking it was a little too much to expect that this wonderful text was going to lead me to a gay couple who were both saints, but they were a gay couple who were both saints.
Ralph and I are going to join in a basic dialogue where I'll ask a question, he'll respond, he'll ask a question, and I'll respond. And we'll try to make it as fun and enjoyable for everyone that's here this evening. Thank you for joining us. We're both quite passionate about this subject and about the film. And I will open with the first question for Ralph. Ralph, outside of academia, I think most people that know John Boswell's name would refer to him or think of him as the LGBTQ advocate historian. But I know that the entirety of his work is much more vast. Can you give us an idea of some of his other works to just kind of elaborate on how well-rounded he was in his chosen discipline?
Absolutely. So John was primarily a historian of medieval Spain, but he was one of the first, not the absolute first, but one of the first to understand that to actually dig deep into the relation of the different communities in medieval Spain, you had to have Hebrew and Arabic. And he had that, of course, as well as Spanish and Catalan. So he did his doctoral work in the archives in largely Barcelona. And in fact, his first book, published in 1977, was entitled The Royal Treasure. It studied the Muslim community under the Christian crown of Aragon in the 14th century. And we could talk, and I'm sure we will talk, about Christianity's social tolerance and homosexuality, but he really began working on that basically at the same time. And it grew out of his conviction that he needed to speak to many questioning communities, which he was doing constantly. After Christianity's social tolerance and homosexuality, his next book was The Kindness of Strangers, about abandoned children. And he used his vast and deep knowledge of legal history, social history, to trace this community, which was often purposely kept invisible. And it's quite a fascinating study, and I recommend it highly. And then, of course, his last book was on same-sex union. So in a way, I will say this, the book that he was planning to write after that would have taken him back to medieval Spain, and it also would have involved the metaphor of the family. So he was, in a way, interested in families, both born and made, and the way different players in this complex mosaic interacted with one another.
Wonderful.
Can I, in turn, ask you a question? When and how did you first become aware of John's work, and what impact did it have on you?
Sure. I'll be happy to answer that, Ralph. I ordinarily answer that by skirting my personal story. I like to keep the attention on the subject matter of whatever film I'm working on, but I'll be a little bit more sharing this evening. I grew up in a typical Midwestern family, Protestant family, where my mom and stepdad were both members of the church vestry, and there was considerable expectation that I would grow and go into ordained ministry. That changed pretty dramatically when the reality of my sexual identity became real, and I shifted gears and went into a career of business instead. I joined the Gay Political Caucus in Houston in the mid-'80s when I moved there. I was a businessman by day and an LGBTQ community activist by night. I had initially heard of Christianity, social tolerance, and homosexuality, of all places, on a Focus on the Family radio show. And they purposely misnamed him John Bosworth. And I think they did that so that people couldn't find the book. I purchased the book eventually at the March on Washington. I went to a Different Light bookstore, and I found it, and I took it home and I consumed it. After my partner at that time and I moved to Los Angeles in 1990, I began to feel a call back to service and ministry. And although I came from an Anglican background, in 1990, there really was no concept of ordination for openly gay people. So that took me on a little bit of an odyssey in researching and searching the 46 other churches in the Anglican Communion. And I was fortunate enough, felt as though I was led to it, to be led to the Church of the Philippines, which had absolutely no prohibitions against gay priests. So I served 2 Filipino congregations in Los Angeles for about 2.5 years as deacon priest. In 1992, the Names Project, the AIDS Memorial Quilt, came to Los Angeles. And my then partner and I went to see it at the LA Convention Center. And we'd been there to see the LA car show and thought, well, maybe they'll have a portion of the community center. And the gut punch that I received that day was that the Names Project quilt filled the entire Los Angeles Convention Center, which is quite humbling and striking. So I returned the next day and I informed my bishop that I would be leaving the church and that I would be doing an independent ministry to the LGBTQ community. And it began at the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Community Center in doing workshops that showed people how they could, in fact, embrace their sexuality and how they could still be Christian. And that work toward the end was put into print. A very close friend of mine who was part of this movement from the very beginning, his name is Ken Ernman. He took audio cassettes and sat down at a typewriter and typed out the 8 hours of seminars that we had put together. And from that, this little guy was born. A little book by the name of A Biblical Defense Guide for Gays, Lesbians, and Those Who Love Them. And my happiest thing about that book is the fact that it still remains on PFLAG's list of books for people struggling to understand how to be both Christian and gay. So John Boswell's command that many gay, lesbian people in the era of the 80s and 90s were lining up in front of their denominations and saying, I want to play a part in Christianity, please let me in. And him saying, you don't have to ask, we've always been a part of it, just go do it, really inspired me and helped inspire the others who I worked with. So I know it was a very long answer, but the importance of Christianity, social tolerance, and homosexuality gave me the intellectual argument that matched the spiritual truth that I'd always carried within myself.
Thank you.
All right, your turn. So in the era that John was publishing CSTH and same-sex unions, the Catholic Church hierarchy had a very different outlook on the LGBTQ community. They supported inflexible doctrinal stances. They tried to diminish talk of LGBTQ affirmation. They even sometimes suspended and removed outspoken authors and supporters, Philip Keane, Charlie Curran, Robert Nugent, and the Vatican openly supported discrimination and lawmaking against LGBTQ people. And here comes John Boswell claiming that same-sex unions were the first marriage ceremonies performed in a church in front of a priest for love. We're going to play a video real quick, and then I'm going to come back and pose my full question to you.
This applies even to notions of permanent Christian marriage, for which the earliest surviving exemplar is a homosexual one. The majority during this period appears to have rejected love as a Christian value, and these two minorities, especially gay people, kept it alive in literature, in art, in their lives, and even in this sacramental way with the first explicit marriage for love. I remind you again, one of the most prominent things about this marriage ceremony is that these people are being bound in a clearly Christian context to each other for life on the basis of love. In the 13th century, the majority simply appropriates this Christian love, a Christian love which had been worked out to a very large extent by these two minorities, appropriates it for itself and then circumscribes it and claims that it only belongs in heterosexual marriage. It is from this point on forbidden to the religious, who up until about a decade ago could not even have particular friendships, and it is forbidden to gay people, whose literature, art, culture, and even marriage ceremony are suppressed or prohibited or made over into heterosexual art, culture, and marriage ceremonies. I might point out that the marriage ceremony that I discovered was copied and recopied through the 14th century. In a 14th century manuscript of it that I have seen, it says above it, for obvious reasons this ceremony can no longer be performed. And in a 15th century manual of liturgy, which contains every other text from the 14th century manual, the gay marriage ceremony is simply omitted without comment.
So Ralph, here comes the full question. I know that in a scholarly context, one's research is often spoken to in terms of creating guideposts for future scholars to continue from, but John sounds very certain of his findings in that audio clip. What was it in his DNA that gave him the courage and the boldness to press forward with the publication of his works when the rest of society didn't share his opinions?
Well, that's a big question. I think that a large part of it has to do with his own personal faith. I think a lot of people may know he was raised an Episcopalian, reading the sources as soon as he could in the original as a teenager. He came to the conclusion that he really needed to be in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, and he converted. So I see him in a certain way as an insider outsider. So on the one hand, he was led to this by his own personal deep conviction and faith, and also an astonishing intellect and command of the languages and sources that few, if any, of the people actually in the church had. He also came to them afresh. He didn't come to them having been inculcated in what they meant. And one of the things I'll say that I think all historians have to learn and teach, and certainly something I learned very much from him, is to be, and forgive me if I sound academic here, beware the teleological argument. In other words, so much of the writing on, say, Catholic theology assumes the position that the current view is the view that has always existed. And so as it looks back, it cherry picks from the sources and just tells the story of how the current view came to being. John, being an honest historian, knew that was not the way to do history. You had to do it moving from the earlier period late and really get a full sense of the range of opinions at every time. And that's what he did. And he had a clarity about him. I will say without, it is very bold in that 1983 lecture. By the time he actually published the book, he felt that it would be more appropriate to call the ceremony a ceremony of union. And he also knew that his argument would be stronger if he didn't push it too far. It certainly is, in his view, the case that ancient attitudes towards marriage, including early Christian ideas of heterosexual coupling, were very, very different. And one of the things about same-sex unions, I know most people think of it as introducing us to this little-known ceremony of brother making, but most of the book is actually about all of the different forms of both same-sex unions and a history of marriage and attitudes towards marriage. So that's what led John to be so confident about his viewpoints, in addition to his moral courage and I think certainly in the era that he grew up and lived in, a feeling that if you speak the truth, it will prevail. And I hope that that's still the case. We see too much today where people are prepared to completely lie about things. But it was mostly the faith, his strong, and he left no stone unturned in working through the sources. So very little ever could be brought up to surprise him. I hope that's a sufficient answer.
That's great. Thank you, Ralph.
You've asked me about some of John Scully works before same-sex unions. So let me turn the tables and ask you how you decided on a particular time span and a focus on the narrative arc that you chose for Not a Tame Lion.
Sure. So in the creative process, especially when you're first spitballing a project, you have to be able to do a public presentation about what the film is going to entail, even when it comes to a documentary. So all films, all movies need a hook. And one of the things that I really appreciated when we shared the film at William and Mary was that one of the professors there stood up during the Q&A and said, "I'm a professor, I'm in a similar field. When I first saw the notice for this film, I thought, how are you going to fill a couple hours on an academician's life? That's pretty boring, dry stuff." And then she said, but the film wasn't. The film was fantastic. And she said, "How did you do that?" And I said, well, the idea for our hook is that if you are a member of the LGBTQ community and you're either married or considering one day being married, you must thank John Boswell. And then we go on to roll out his contributions to the LGBTQ community. Without that hook, it truly would have been difficult to attach importance to his work directly to people in this age, in this era. Luckily, marriage equality began in 2015, and we're no longer where we were prior to that, but that was our hook that got initial interest or early interest in the film. And we also utilized the headlines of the day. I remember myself coming home from work and turning on the television in the era of the 80s and 90s, and it was all doom and gloom and, death and AIDS and, round up the gays before, things really go sideways in America. And he certainly gave us moral clarity that was certainly needed in the era. Each of the films that we've created, and this was our fourth film, I believe is because there's been a hole in the canon of LGBTQ film. And no one else was making any of the films that we made, particularly this one. As important as John Boswell has been in my life and into the lives of so many that I've encountered throughout my work and, my activism work in ministry, it was just mind-numbing to me that a film had not been made. So again, it's going back to the old adage from LGBTQ activism, wherever you are, do what you can wherever you are with what you have. So we were able to, pitch a film, make a film, produce a film, and then distribute a film. So hope that answered it.
Yeah, thanks.
So this is a non-serious question, and I know it's a little leading, seeing that I've spent as much time as I have kind of circulating in John Boswell's world with his friends and loved ones over the last 3 years. But being among his closest friends, peers, even colleagues, you were able to witness John in a way that few people living today were able to. And as seriously academically minded as he was, John also had a great sense of humor. He possessed fantastic comedic timing in his lectures. And he held some unexpected, even quirky traits. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. What would you like to share with the viewers that they will never read in a biography about the man?
Well, John was very aware that his work was extremely esoteric. And, to start with that, every year, what he would do for his Lenten observance was learn a new language, and by reading the New Testament in that language. So he was aware of how esoteric his world was. At the same time, he loved popular culture, and he loved to revel in it. He loved pop music. I'm not good at remembering, but nothing would make him happier than being out on the dance floor, bopping away, and just giving himself into the rhythm. And he, as much as he also played classical music, he played a lot of popular music as well. And he took great delight in all sorts of trappings of American popular culture. I think you talk in the film about his obsession with Disney and Disneyland, and going there was always a great thing. He shared that with his partner's family, and he just had a great time doing that. He also loved to throw parties. Friday nights in New Haven, it was always a circle of us who went out for dinner, and this was just a great deal of fun. No seriousness whatsoever, but just a group of people coming together and having a good time. Is there anything else that would be really interesting? Well, you talked about his teaching, and I think, this is not just, this brings it together. He used popular references in his lectures to make some points about what the serious stuff that he was teaching. And, he made all sorts of interesting points to get people to think. For example, there was a famous lecture of his called Angels and Atoms, where people would always laugh at the idea that the scholastics would be debating how many angels could be on the pin head of the head of a pin. And he used examples about how it is we believe things in our common world. And also, do you believe everything that you see on TV? Is everything you see on TV true? And getting people to understand through his references to various sitcoms and this and that we recognize the genres. So he brought his love of popular culture right into the classroom. And he was, for that reason, beloved of his students and very proud when he was voted the sexiest professor at Yale.
Excellent.
So I guess it's my turn to ask you, we were talking about sitcoms in a moment. You and your partner have created a fictional series. What impels you to undertake documentaries as well?
Well, narrative fiction is wonderful as a writer because you get to create a universe that didn't really exist. And in the case of our series, Treading Yesterday, it was historical fiction. So as a writer, I was able to take the experiences that I had as a young gay man in the 80s and translate it into quasi-historical remembrance of the time, fleshing out characters, many based on real people. And I was able to spin them into a world of my own creation. Now, with that said, that's a very expensive hobby. Just to give you an idea, each episode costs in excess of $100,000 to make for the simple fact that there's a cast of 20 actors involved. There's a crew of anywhere from 15 to 20 people on set on a daily basis. And then there are all of the costs as far as locations and feeding people and insurance and all of that good stuff. So the simple answer is documentaries are down and dirty. They're relatively inexpensive. You can make a documentary for about half of what an episode of Treading Yesterday costs. Similarly, you can make a documentary with a crew of 4 as opposed to a crew of 20. And you can have a rolling timeline that actually fits the individuals that you're going to interview and your small crew, which makes it a way simpler project from start to finish to make. And then going back to my initial point from earlier, the 2 documentary features that we've made have been made because they were just glaring holes in the canon of LGBTQ cinema. And now we're going to play another, oops, actually, no, I jumped the gun, my apologies. I have another question for you, Ralph. Sorry about that, everybody. Not a Tame Lion was the 3rd film project in which we highlighted, to some extent, John Boswell and his work. If another project involving John and his life were to be taken up, what would you like to see the focus on? Maybe a biopic like Milk, or what would you think?
Wow. I could think in a couple of different directions. I mean, there's his family, which is wonderful. I think his sister Pat is one of the people attending.
Absolutely.
And the family would be wonderful. And also I think you could absolutely make a biopic of his path of discovery and the kind of courage that we saw before. I could also actually imagine a film would be very different, would be less about his life, but as I mentioned, the book that preceded same-sex unions, Unabandoned Children, and there's so many things. He wrote that book before 23andMe before Ancestry.com, and so many people are discovering long lost siblings and discovering that some pious stories they may have had from their family weren't exactly true. And I think that that's another one of his books where there's a way, it would almost be like a version of Roots, but a very unusual version. So I could imagine something like that. You can tell I'm not a filmmaker. I'm not very good at coming up with these.
I'll see if I can come up with a hook for that one, Ralph.
Yeah, yeah. So talking about the film, I know that to focus on Not a Tame Lion, and by the way, I don't know whether everyone knows that that is a quotation from C.S. Lewis, one of the books of Narnia, which he and his family loved deeply. So I could imagine a fantasy literature. And I will also mention that among his papers are fragments of an interesting novel that he was working on set in 14th and 15th century Barcelona. That would be quite an interesting film. But back to my question of you is, this period was before we all had cell phones, and there were lots of, an excess perhaps of visuals of some things we might or might not want preserved. How did you approach the challenge of finding the visual representation on beyond the extremely handsome talking heads you had in the film?
That's a great point, Ralph, and it almost became a sticking point in the creation of the film. The majority of documentaries have newsreel footage or personal footage that was taken via camera. And with John's death in 1994, right on the cusp of digital technology being introduced, I mean, I remember, I don't think I had my first personal computer in my home until maybe a year after his death, maybe around the year of his death, but maybe a year after his death. And I know my first digital camera didn't arrive in my hands until maybe even 99. So the world was a vastly different place, and we weren't really followed with cameras at that time. So it became quite challenging not to have newsreel, personal footage, even home movie footage of his life. But I have to give a lot of credit to Pat Boswell, his sister, who has worked her entire life to keep his memory alive. And when we decided to go ahead with the film, she raided all of her scrapbooks and her family photo albums, and she gave me absolutely everything that she had that we were able to work into the film. And what we didn't have, we just kind of winged it. But certainly it would have been probably a more visually interesting film had we had, say, lots of lecture footage from his lectures at Yale, or even if organizations like Dignity that he spoke at almost annually would have had some archival footage. But we searched and we searched, and there was none to be found. So one thing that I would like to mention, though, it was really an incredible find. The second work in which we had John Boswell as a portion of it was for a television docuseries pilot titled Sorry We Missed You. The idea behind it was there are wonderful people throughout history that have done great things, but for whatever reason, they're not part of our collective consciousness. So we did the pilot for this on John Boswell to introduce him. And after that pilot premiered and was being passed around, one of the participant interviewees, Pastor John Lewis in Long Beach, California, he's a United Methodist pastor, he posted on Facebook about his involvement in the pilot, and a colleague of his, also a United Methodist pastor from the town next to his, mentioned that when he took the church, he went through just boxes of old media, and he found a set of cassette tapes rubber banded together that were marked on and said something about John Boswell public lecture in 1983. And he listened to them and realized that they were going to be lost to time. So this pastor digitally preserved the audio. And if it hadn't been for that, and if he hadn't seen Pastor Lewis's post, we wouldn't have had the audio for the West Hollywood Presbyterian 3 days of lectures. And we have the entire lecture from each of the days, and we have it for posterity. And that was just an aside. It was just a wonderful, happy accident. And those don't happen very often.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have one clip that we'd like to play right now, and we'll come right back.
And given my work here at the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion, we are both an academic research center and also an advocacy and community building center. I decided I would focus my article on the impact that that book had had on people, in particular, Christians struggling with their identities in terms of sexual orientation. And I was able to access a number of letters that had been written to John in the years since his book had been published. And the challenge for me was picking just a few of literally hundreds of comments from people, many of whom spoke about the ways in which that book had saved their lives.
Now, Bernie was speaking to the letters that I believe you had stored in your attic for a while before turning them over to Yale, in which people sent personal comments to John after reading CSTH and sharing how it had impacted and in many cases saved their lives. And what I'd like to do now, if you're okay with it, Ralph, is I'd like to read some of the comments that Not a Tame Lion has received. We're basically streaming on 9 or 10 different streaming platforms, including the big guys, Amazon and Tubi and Google Play and all the rest, but we're also streaming on some of the smaller LGBTQ streaming sites like Deku and We Are Pride. And these comments come from We Are Pride, and I'm just going to read them like a news anchor for you. And then at the very end, I'll ask you what you think. But there are quite a few of them, but I think they're really, really gripping. I'm 55 years old, part of the LGBTQ community. I'm almost embarrassed to say that I've never heard of John Boswell until I watched this film. I'm working on my own Ph.D. and will, if possible, work some of his work into it. As of tonight, I've bought 3 of his books. It's worth every penny. Thank you so much for this film. I was given a copy of CSTH in '91 by a friend. It changed my life. I realized my family and their religion had been completely wrong about everything they told me. There was such a profound relief that followed. I bought all of John Boswell's books and devoured them. He is a gay folk hero. Amazing program, amazing man. As a gay man of 63 years old, I can't find words for the gratitude and awe-inspiring gifts John Boswell gave to this world. I'm so in awe now. This touching documentary brought so many memories as a young Brazilian gay man living in the US, working on my doctorate in the 1990s. I bought both books. I was hit by a bus. I had no idea somebody somewhere on this planet could write about homosexuality with the tremendous scholarly authority that he had. God bless you, Jeb. Love and gratitude from us below. As I was coming out in the 80s, my therapist referred me to CSTH, which changed my life. We used this book. We used the same-sex unions book in creating the liturgy for our wedding in 1993. It is stunning to me now, to the extent that that book has dropped out of sight. We all owe him such a substantial gift and debt. Many thanks for this documentary. What a glorious hero. As a storyteller, it's so enriching. I'm so glad to find this. I listened to John Boswell's lectures in West Hollywood and read several of his books, a great historian and a great human being. This one is of particular interest. I knew Jeb in Boston when he was a graduate student at Harvard. In November of 1970, he spoke at a conference that I chaired on the church and the homosexual, attended by approximately 100 clergy, seminary students, and gay community leaders. He spoke very convincingly in a manner that was both scholarly and cherubic about how the Old Testament and New Testament passages used as the foundation for Christian intolerance of gay people and how they were interpreted incorrectly. This is a wonderful documentary about his life and his impactful writings and teachings. Two last ones that I want to share. So happy that the algorithm recommended this documentary. I wasn't aware of Jeb, but immediately bought same-sex unions for me and my beloved. I'm so inspired by his life, his work, his impact. Thank you. And then finally, this was before my time, but I'm glad to see that LGBT people of previous generations before me are remembering those who had contributed so greatly. I have some books to read. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but as someone who was personally not only John's close friend, but who assisted him with the research for both books and assisted in their publishing, the comments that were in the letters in your attic that Bernie was commenting on really are powerfully mirrored by the comments that I just read out loud 43 years later. What are your thoughts?
Well, wow. Just first, wow. But a little frustrated, because how is it that we're still fighting and the people are still fighting to find out this information? I know there's so much information out there, it's hard. So that's why the documentary you've made and getting word out is the right thing to do. The letters, and actually the letters in the collection, which is now in the archives at Yale, actually predate the publication of CSTH, because many of them were written as he went around and gave these presentations and lectures. And many of them are absolutely heartbreaking. Young people in situations that are awful. I don't know, I don't know what the format would be. That would be an incredible movie too, somehow.
Agreed, yeah.
But I will say, when I reflect on my own activism and naivete, if you told me when I was working with John, you already back as I was an officer of the Harvard Radcliffe Gay Students Association in the early 70s, if you told me that people would still be struggling with this 50 years later, I think, guess in the optimism of youth, I would find that hard to believe. But I also understand that the powers we're up against are so strong and in so many ways work very hard to prevent change, that we should just keep remembering these things and keep battling on. But thank goodness they have the documentary and are led back to the books.
Excellent.
I wonder if we should switch to questions now.
Looks like there aren't very many. Why don't you go ahead and ask your last question, and then we'll go ahead and tackle them.
Okay. Well, has the reception of Not a Tame Lion surprised you in any way?
Well, every film that you work on, there are good things and there's some not so good things. So I'll start with the good things. When Not a Tame Lion opened its premiere weekend in the film festival circuit, we had our world premiere at the Chichester International Film Festival in West Sussex, England. And it's not a competitive film festival that awards trophies or winning titles. But out of the 6,000 or 7,000 films that were submitted, only 23 were selected. So for us to be starting with our premiere in a festival where we were one of 23 of 5,000 or 6,000, that made us feel really good. The next day, Our US premiere was at the Rhode Island International Film Festival, and that's a top 10 film festival in the United States. They're able to push films directly to the Academy Awards for consideration. Only 10 film festivals in the US are able to do that. And on that day, we actually won grand prize, which was day 2. And in day 3, we were in another indie film festival in the United States, and we won Best Documentary Feature. So there was a press release the day after our opening weekend, and I was absolutely beside myself to even comment on the fact that the film had been so wildly successful on its first weekend. Now, as far as something that doesn't take my breath away, I've been disappointed in the fact that the large streaming services, Amazon and Tubi, haven't given the film much exposure or visibility. So on the streaming sites that could reach the most people, the film isn't being highlighted at all, and that's quite sad and disappointing. It's doing quite well on the LGBTQ streaming sites, clearly. On We Are Pride, from which I took those comments, in the first month, there were 50,000 full viewings of the film, so definitely reaching a lot of people through there. But I'm most disappointed in the fact that the larger streaming sites, just people aren't accessing the film on either of those. And it really goes back to what Dustin Lance Black, who wrote Milk and several other great LGBTQ films, has said. In 2017, he had a 5-part series called When We Rise that explored gay liberation. And I remember after the first 2 nights, he was on every morning talk show after that, just imploring the audiences to please watch NBC tonight, because if we don't even support films that are made about us, studios will not ever make films about us. So, it's a lesson that all filmmakers in the LGBTQ bucket have to learn. And it's just, less than satisfying.
Great. Well, I've noted, if I might, I noted a question from Max Strasfeld in the chat about one of the ways Boswell gets known these days is as an essentialist. In the essentialist constructionist debate, people tend to contrast him with Michel Foucault and assume there's a dispute between them that Foucault blurbed CSTH. It's clear that's an oversimplification. So I'd be happy to talk briefly about this. Jeb was so surprised. Everyone knows that's his nickname now. Was so surprised that he got Brandon an essentialist. And I think that early on, Foucault in the History of Sexuality took the Academy by storm in the 80s. And Jeb worked before that. Foucault absolutely respected him. In fact, Michel took him to leather bars in Paris. But it was, I think this is a subset of the reaction of the academic left to Jeb's work altogether, not to impugn their own scholarship, but for at least a decade, if not 20 years, LGBTQ scholarship hardly thought we needed to look and do serious historical work because it's only, the identity only got constructed when the word was introduced in 1878. That's also a slight oversimplification, but fortunately, scholars of early modern Europe and other places worked on more sophisticated and nuanced versions of this. So I'll just say that Jeb was absolutely not an essentialist. Yes, he believed that there have been people at all times who experience desire for members of their own sex, but he absolutely understands that how they understood themselves was completely contingent on their time, place, and culture. So I think it's a ridiculous and misleading characterization of him to cast him out as an essentialist, and therefore you don't need to study him. He's very nuanced about that. I see another question. Uh, I don't know, Craig, some of these. So I see a question from Richard Taylor about Martin Duberman's negative reaction to Boswell. Duberman thought that Boswell opposed the idea of a graduate program focused on LGBTQ concerns. What do you think of that? Well, that's a long and complicated story. And I was with John in the 80s when we had many meetings in Martin Duberman's apartment in New York. And John was not opposed to a graduate program focused on LGBTQ concerns, but on that front, he thought it needed to be wider. But in particular, the argument was about a center, and Martin and those of his camp originally wanted the center to be at Yale, but it's just a matter of governance that it couldn't have been controlled in a way that Duberman liked. So they went on and established the center at CUNY. And at Yale, we had a series of conferences in the 80s, as many people know. And but I definitely think that John's nuance would have been that you can't study LGBTQ issues without being aware of larger ones. So I think he would have been concerned about a program that was too focused. And his own work shows that he's setting things in, for example, in the way that society's treated a whole set of minorities. Craig, I see one question.
Could I just jump in on Duberman really quick?
Yeah.
Our first documentary feature titled Homo Say What talks about the concept of where homophobia, what the genesis of homophobia in the US was. Because again, no one had ever made that film, ridiculously enough. And I was able to pull some people that are over 50 will remember this idea, but there were cable outlets in every major city that had like, gosh, what was it called? Cable access television, where you could just start a show and go into a studio and host it. And there was a New York City show that Duberman was on, and the interviewer discussed with him John Boswell and his work, and he was very supportive of CSTH at the time. And I actually have that clip in Homo Say What. So, there may have been some friction there at some point, but overall, I think he was very positive in the work that John did.
So I know we're at 6. I see one question that has your name on it in the sense, what is the main message from the film or the type of impact you hope the film will make?
Well, marriage equality happened in June of 2015. Civil rights for LGBTQ people in the United States have continued to be under threat since the passage of marriage equality. And as we saw with the repeal of Roe versus Wade, it wouldn't be too difficult for gay marriage to be repealed at some point. So I believe that the context of John Boswell's life and work throws a tremendous amount of moral clarity and scholarship at the topic. And I think that most people, particularly in the millennial and Gen Z age groups, have never heard of him. And as some of the comments showed from the section that I read before, many of the people that are watching the documentary have never heard of him or heard of his work before. So people don't read anymore. If it's more than a tweet, it's very difficult for them. He wrote amazing volumes that liberate human beings from oppression. And those need to be preserved and they need to be shared. So the documentary was done for two reasons. Number one, for that, and number two, to ensure that LGBTQ civil rights continue to move forward, not backwards.
And I see one Mark Hengartner was asking, can you comment on what John might think about the progress of equal marriage? Is there any aspect of the church's response that would have surprised, disappointed, or encouraged him? John always believed that the doctrine developed, and I think is so interesting that just in the past couple of months, Francis has the Pope has said that there can be blessings of same-sex couples, not in the liturgical sense. So I think he would see this as the kind of very slow and gradual movement. I think he would be horrified at so much that's going on in our world today. Absolutely horrified. And in anti-Semitism in all of its various forms. He was very sensitive to that. And he was a supporter of all minorities, of all people.
All right, so should we pass it to Mark to invite those that would like to stay to stick around?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Craig and Ralph, for this provocative and informative discussion about a very important historical figure and an influence in terms of our queer religious history. Thanks to all of you who participated and offered comments and questions. In a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs as well as recordings of all of our past presentations. Our next program, the presentation of the annual Virginia Ramey Mollenkai Award for Outstanding Research and Writing in Queer Religious History, will be both in person and live streamed from Union Theological Seminary in New York on Wednesday evening, March 6th. If you will be in the New York City area then, please join us live. Information about registering for the live stream will be available soon. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. You can either scan the QR code you see on the screen or type in giveq.org. That's just giveq.org on your phone, tablet, or laptop. With your credit card in hand, it only takes a couple of minutes to make a gift. Your gift will make a difference. Remind you viewers that if you'd like to offer personal greetings or comments to Ralph or Craig, stay here and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. On behalf of everyone here, I offer much gratitude to Craig and Ralph for this scintillating dialogue. Good night, everyone.